Now. Okay, so time is yours, Kik.
Thanks, Arya. Selamat pagi. Welcome, everyone, wherever it may be that you're zooming in from bright and early on a Friday morning. On the panel alone, I'm coming to you from Singapore. We have Ellie in the ACT, Wulan in Victoria, Fran in New South Wales, and Marcella in Queensland. So whilst we're probably all feeling a little bit kezumaan at the moment, it's also fantastic to be able to bring this panel together across such diverse locations. Before we begin today, it's also important to acknowledge the many lands we're dialing in from and the First Nations people who have cared for country for over 60,000 years in Australia. On behalf of our panel, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal, Wurundjeri, Gadigal, Turrbal and Yagara people, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We'd like to extend that respect to all Indigenous attendees with us here today as well. Links between Indigenous Australians and Indonesians go back hundreds of years, and we acknowledge and celebrate these as well. The early relationships, the knowledge exchange between the Yolngu and Bugis peoples. These early exchanges set the scene for our modern day sharing of knowledge, culture and ideas across the seas and in fora such as the ACICIS conference today. On behalf of the panel, I'd also like to express our concern, our solidarity and our deep condolences for everyone in Indonesia as the COVID situation unfolds. We stand with you. Welcome to today's panel, which I feel very honoured to be chairing, the online pivot, deepening the Australia-Indonesia relationship through virtual study abroad programs. Firstly, and I can see that we've still got attendees coming in, I'd like to ask our audience how many of you have participated in Australia-Indonesia mobility programs. And you can do that and test out our Q&A function at the same time by just leaving a yes, or you might want to leave the program name in the chat box. Sorry, not the chat box, the Q&A box. Perhaps you did a high school exchange, I did, or a study tour to Indonesia as a school student, or perhaps your family hosted a student. Maybe you participated in a university exchange or were a participant of the IEP or ACICIS programs. Perhaps you were the recipient of a government scholarship such as the New Colombo Plan, the Dharma Siswa or the Australia Awards or their various iterations. Or maybe you did a professional mobility program through Bridge, AVI, Endeavour or another organisation. Great, so I can see some of those coming through on the chat box, which is lovely to have such an engaged audience. On the panel, we too have some experience with mobility programs. We have 4 engaging presenters today who I'm going to briefly introduce, but I'm not going to do them justice in the short time that I have. So please do read their profiles in the conference booklet, or better still, look them up and connect with them on LinkedIn because I'm sure they'll be happy to accept your invitation. Our first speaker today is Elena, or Ellie Williams, who will be known to many of you as ACICIS's resident director from 2013 to 2017. Ellie is now a higher education consultant and a PhD candidate at ANU, where her research examines the impact of student mobility and DFAT-funded higher education programs on the Australia-Indonesia relationship. Ellie currently serves on the boards of DFAT's Australia-Indonesia Institute and the Balai Bahasa of New South Wales. She is a panel member for the selection committees for the Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program, IEP, as well as the Australia Awards Indonesia. Our second speaker is Putu Lila Wulandari, or Wulan, who has served as ACICIS's public health study tour leader since 2017, and she's successfully delivered 4 program iterations to more than 120 ACICIS students. Wulan holds a PhD in medicine from the Kirby Institute at UNSW, where she remains a research fellow, whilst also lecturing in the Faculty of Medicine at Udayana University in Bali. Marcella Lapetosa and Francis Baxter are the co-founders of Value Learning Intercultural Specialists, which are the current program managers appointed by DFAT for IEP. Marcella is a learning designer and facilitator who has worked on multiple Australia-Indonesia mobility programs, as well as many others, including IEP and the Victoria Young Leaders to Indonesia program. Marcella has a background in child psychology and holds a master's in cross-cultural psychology. Her co-conspirator at Value Learning is Fran Baxter, who is an intercultural educator who has consulted with community, education, and government organisations to design and deliver transformational learning interventions with students, volunteers, staff, and educators across Australia and globally. Fran's a former CEO of AFS Australia, where she oversaw AFS's management of IAP, VYL Indonesia, and many other mobility programs. In recent years, thousands of Australian and Indonesian students have experienced each other's countries through educational programs, building up linguistic, socio-political, and cultural capacity. The various international travel bans that have resulted from COVID, however, have paused students' experience of in-country study, forcing programs to go online. However, this pivot has already delivered innovative and agile responses from Australia-Indonesia educational partners, resulting in high levels of student satisfaction, sustained and sometimes increased enrolments, and a raft of other positive outcomes, which we will learn more about today. Ellie's presentation is going to set the scene for us. She's going to challenge and contextualize the traditional authority of the field as a site of intercultural learning between Australia and Indonesia. We're then going to hear about two examples of recent online programs, which are both focused on adult learners, ACICIS and IAP. I'm going to stop there because I want to hand over to our speakers. We do have a team approach to today's panel, so we'll be taking questions at the end of all three presentations. But we've ensured that we have a block of time for that. So, please ask your question throughout the presentation. We'll record that and get to it in the Q&A time at the end of our session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ellie, and I'm just going to remind our other speakers that we'll turn our sound and video off to give Ellie the floor.
Thank you, Kik. That's wonderful. I'm just going to start sharing my screen from over here. Okay, there we go. You can all see that okay? Excellent. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and selamat pagi. Especially selamat pagi to our friends in Indonesia and in the region, because I know it is very early for you over there, and also friends joining from Perth. So thank you all so much for coming along this morning. As Kik mentioned, we're going to be focusing this morning on this shift from learning abroad in physical capacity to a virtual capacity. So my presentation this morning is from going there to going online, understanding Australia and Indonesia through virtual student mobility. And this really came about by a lot of questions that came up last year as COVID sort of came up, and we started to really look at what does this actually mean for learning abroad? What does this mean for how we can go there if we can't actually physically go there? So today, what I'm going to be going through, I'm going to go briefly through a history of this notion of going there and unpacking this concept in a little bit more detail in the way that it appears in some of the international education literature, the Indonesian studies literature, and anthropology. I'm going to look briefly at the history of Indonesians going there, so studying in Australia, and Australians studying in Indonesia. I want to look also at the impact that COVID has been having on this notion of going there and how it's forced us to pivot to going online and what that's meant for virtual study abroad. I also then want to look at this concept that comes up in the literature around internationalisation at home and the possibilities and opportunities, I think, that virtual learning abroad is actually presenting for internationalisation at home. And finally, I want to look at where we go from here, and so new ways of going there that virtual mobility actually presents. So to start with, I want to unpack this notion of going there. The reason why I'm very interested in this concept is the way that it really takes authority or primacy in a lot of the literature around international education, anthropology, Indonesian studies, and other related disciplines. We see time and time again that there is an emphasis on the importance of the field as a site of authority. So to go there is to truly know or to truly understand a people and a place and its people. We know, of course, that there are many ways that Australians and Indonesians get to know each other through travel, sport, business, but the emphasis here that I want to talk about today, that we're all talking about today, is on these educational linkages that have really formed over many years. So to unpack this a little bit further, one thing I find really interesting is the way that we start to see many parallels in this concept of going there between the literature from anthropology and a lot of the literature on learning abroad from international education. So where this might be posited as, in anthropology, perhaps as dwelling or as a notion of fieldwork or deep engagement, in learning abroad, we see this framed over many years as a concept of deep immersion. So students on learning abroad programs will engage through a framework of immersion, which many scholars argue is actually reminiscent of this special status of fieldwork in anthropology. So these parallels come up time and time again. It's this concept of going there and this concept of being in the field to really and truly know a place. What we see is an emphasis on being immersed. So we see this, I'll let you read this quote yourselves, but we see in many quotes from international education literature and anthropology literature, this notion of an assumed absorption that's going to take place, an assumed transformation. And this idea that this learning has to be done in that country for someone to truly know and to truly understand. Again, the emphasis is on going there. So what does that actually look like in practice? I'm not going to go into a complete history because that's far beyond the scope of this presentation, but to give some highlights, I suppose, of a history of Indonesians going there, we look at, I suppose, the early beginnings of Indonesians coming to Australia. We have from the 1950s onwards, Colombo Plan scholars, pictured here, some of them coming over to Australia. And the Colombo Plan was a scholarship scheme for Asia Pacific students, postgraduate students, who could travel to Commonwealth countries, including, of course, Australia. And in Australia, we had around 20,000 students who studied here from the 50s till about the late 80s. And this was really configured as part of Australia's aid program. So the emphasis here was on capacity building. These would be scholars who would come to Australia, gain the requisite skills that they needed to then return to their countries, many of which were newly democratized, new republics in the region, and take the skills that they needed back to their home countries. So in the Australian case, as I said, it's about 20,000 students, around 17 to 20% of those over the years were Indonesian. Following on from this, we then saw other scholarship schemes such as the Endeavour Awards, and of course today the Australia Awards. Again, this was a big part of it and continues to be a big part of Australia's aid program. But we know that there are also many other ways that Indonesians go there to Australia. So scholarship schemes are just one part of that, but the latest figures from Austrade of pre-pandemic numbers travelling to Australia, from 2019, we saw that there were 22,000 Indonesians studying in Australia. And this actually comprises secondary level students, vet students, ELICOS students as well, so language students, and undergraduate and postgraduate researchers as well. So there's a real mix in there, but 22,000 Indonesians who were going there prior to the pandemic. Looking the other way, if we look at a history of going there for Australians to Indonesia, again, far too long to go into in great detail in this presentation, but of course, many people in this conference would be familiar with the legacy of Herb Faith and the educational and voluntary exchanges that he started and what would go on to then become Australian Volunteers International. And then over many years, while there were certainly more structured arrangements in the secondary sector, so school tours, Rotary, AFS programs, sending around 50 students or so a year, in the tertiary space, that was quite different. So we started to see more ad hoc arrangements. It was individual students traveling. It was university to university arrangements, academics who had personal relationships with other academics setting up programs together. So it really was based on these personal relationships, and there was nothing really quite formalized until the formation of ACICIS in 1995. So what we started to see from that period onwards, in the first full year of 2 semesters that ACICIS sent students, which was 1996, we had 72 students in that first full year. And then right up to 2019, again, pre-pandemic data, we had around 540 students as well. And I think it's important to point out here that that 540 figure is actually about a quarter of the total number that travelled to Indonesia, which was about 2,061 in 2019. And I'll get to more on that in a minute. But what we started to see also over the years as well with ACICIS, but also with individual Australian universities sending students, was that patterns in mobility were beginning to change as well. So while today we still, of course, have the few students who will travel and do a full semester or a full academic year, where we had that student who was doing an Indonesian major or Asian studies major and spending significant time in country, increasingly as degree structures have changed and students want to fast track their degrees, and we see this happening over summer programs and winter programs, we start to see shorter mobility programs as well. So 2-week study tours, which Wulan will talk about in a moment, right up to 4-week and 6-week programs as well, and going across lots of different disciplines. Now, as I mentioned, this was going ahead anyway, but arguably something that was a game changer in the sector and which really propelled this forward was the Australian government's New Colombo Plan Scholarship Scheme, which launched in 2014. So this, as I described earlier, the New Colombo Plan really was an inversion of the Colombo Plan, which I described earlier. So in this case, this is actually young undergraduate Australian students going out into the region, as opposed to Asia Pacific scholars coming into Australia. And it really was the brainchild of former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, pictured here, who really saw this as a rite of passage for young Australians to go on to become young ambassadors for Australia in our region. By 2021, the Australian government has invested more than $200 million in the program. Over 60,000 students have received an NCP award, and that includes over 10,000 for Indonesia. Funding has recently been renewed in the May 2021 budget for around $50 million moving forward, which does show some commitment from the government moving forward. And there's other details we can get into, but we might save that for later. But point being, it's been a game changer, and prior to the pandemic in 2019, numbers of undergraduate students to Indonesia were soaring. But then, of course, as with every sector in the world, COVID had other plans for us, and COVID has presented significant challenges for international education and student mobility. And that question that I posed at the very beginning really came up a lot of how can we continue to go there when we can't actually physically go there? What we started to see throughout last year was a lot of questioning, and it was really a time of deep crisis, I think. Many organisations were facing the prospect of closure. ACICIS is one of them. Some others, unfortunately, did close. AFS Australia is one of those. And certainly individual university international officers were trying to work out how they were going to actually pivot their programs online, how they would sustain numbers, and what this meant for the future of learning abroad. What we started to see, and thanks to the incredible lobbying efforts of ACICIS and other organisations and university bodies as well around the country, from August 2020 last year, DFAT gave the green light for virtual mobility to go ahead. So this essentially meant that any program which already had an allocated NCP funding attached to it could actually be delivered virtually if it was possible. So ACICIS was well placed to sort of pivot their programs as they had staff on the ground and things ready to go. And I'll let Wulan talk more about that in a moment. But the good thing about this is that it actually meant, well, if this was a DFAT funded program with NCP, it also meant that other DFAT funded programs could also get the green light, such as IEP, or also the Australia-Indonesia Muslim Exchange Program, which the AII also funds. But of course, it wasn't always smooth sailing to begin with. And the first question that a lot of people asked was, well, if learning abroad is based on this concept of going there and deep immersion, how on earth can you actually learn abroad virtually? How can you do the deep hanging out that comes with immersion? How can you do an internship? How can you go to a community over Zoom effectively? But what we started to see, and this is just a brief snapshot because I know Wulan and Fran and Marcella will talk about this in more detail, what we started to see was some really creative responses to how you actually go online. So we started seeing Indonesian language classes offered over Zoom, virtual tours of community health centres, newsrooms, things like that, internships that were completed remotely. And in fact, many of the internship hosts actually found this approach much more real life, work ready, preparing students for a digital newsroom environment and a digital workplace. And students who are working in pairs or small groups on project-based tasks, Zoom webinars, socialising with buddies, and self-reflexive learning modules, which really complemented the students' learning together on Zoom. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this about what virtual student mobility has been bringing up is the way that it actually reflects a concept that already has been in the literature for some years, which is internationalisation at home. So where traditionally this idea of internationalisation at home might have meant, a way of bringing international students on campuses, internationalising the curriculum for students, or setting internationalisation KPIs or targets for staff and institutions, really giving your students in a domestic setting the chance to have a global experience without going abroad. We're starting to see this more and more, that students, obviously not being able to leave, not being able to go anywhere. This is really challenging that notion of internationalisation at home and what it can mean, and offering up new contexts and new ways that that can play out through new modalities. So what does that actually open up? Well, importantly, I think one thing that we're starting to see, even in just a year of this online pivot in learning abroad, is an increased inclusivity. So students who might otherwise not be able to participate in learning abroad, and certainly Lee Tran and other international education scholars have written a great deal on the barriers to inclusion and participation, but students from low SES backgrounds, people with disability, carers, part-time, first in family, students who normally wouldn't be able to give up their place in a share house over summer, or their part-time job, or are caring for young children, suddenly are able to participate because it's from their living room. They still receive the financial funding to do it. They don't need to go and get a passport, and so on. So while it might not be the perfect exposure to a new country and culture, it is opening up what abroad means. And I think that that's significant. Secondly, another thing that I think, virtual learning abroad is doing is really challenging this notion of the field, which I discussed earlier, and that authority that, the only way to know Indonesia or Australia is actually by going there physically. The strong early learning outcomes from ACICIS summer programs, almost 100% of students would recommend the programs despite them being offered virtually. They noted that they gained credit, they gained professional experiences, and they still found it worthwhile. Similarly, for IEP, this program over summer, even though it was delivered online, was able to foster intercultural learning outcomes for participants between Australia and Indonesia without actually going there. And I know Fran and Mars have some great data on that they're going to present. So apologies for the small graph here. I will share my slides later so you can have a closer look at this. But looking ahead, what does this actually mean, and why is this significant both for practitioners and researchers? I think that this offers ways to combine the virtual and the physical components of learning abroad moving forward. So we see that virtual modalities can actually be a complementary approach to learning abroad. So if you have students, once we do go back to Indonesia, or once Indonesians come back to Australia, we can start to see actually now that having a structured online program to accompany that is a real complement. We've seen that key learning outcomes can be achieved, and in fact, in some cases even exceeded than in regular years. As I mentioned, there's been an emphasis on inclusivity in the space, and I think that this opens up, please excuse that, and redefines learning abroad. Sorry about that. Finally, the significance of this, as I mentioned, for practitioners and for researchers. For practitioners, I think this shows us how we can be innovative through education and continue to build Australia-Indonesia relationships virtually while we can't travel. And for researchers, I think this really opens up new research spaces to critically examine students' experiences of learning abroad without the physical travel, to build on that concept of internationalisation at home that I mentioned earlier, and to challenge the authority or the primacy of the field in learning abroad. I think particularly at this point in time when we're really, many of us are grappling with what, the shape of Indonesian studies as an area studies more broadly, I think this actually offers significant import for what we can do in terms of this research space and thinking through what this might mean for Indonesian studies, but also what this might mean for international education research moving forward as well. So that's it from me for now. But I do want to just put in one shameless plug, because it wouldn't be an academic conference without one. But I did want to say that if you are interested in reading more about this issue, in a couple of weeks, we have a special issue of Inside Indonesia coming up. which will be on Australia-Indonesia Virtual Educational Exchange. And Rati Indraswari from UNPAR and I have been putting this together, and there are some fantastic contributors in here from ACICIS and IEP and undergrads and international education researchers and postgrads and government agencies. And we would love for you to check it out if you have a moment. So thank you all very much, and I will stop sharing. Thank you, and hand over to Wulan.
Okay. Thanks, Ellie. I would like to share my screen first. Okay. So thanks, Ellie, for the presentation that really related with the current presentation that I would like to deliver. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Luhputu Lila Wulandari. You can call me Wulan. I'm the former ACICIS Public Health Study Tour Leader since 2017. Currently, I'm working as a research fellow at the Kirrilee Institute, UNSW. My title of the presentation is the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Study, or ACICIS Public Health Study Tour, or PHST. So I think Ellie has touched a lot upon the ACICIS program. So now I would like to maybe focusing on the PHST, or the Public Health Study Tour. This is one of the programs that ACICIS has been running since 2016. And before the pandemic, it has been conducted in Indonesia, where the students were coming and visiting the country. But since last year, the program has been conducted virtually due to the pandemic. This PHST program is aimed to provide students with information on how the public health sector works in Indonesia and the public health challenges. And this program becoming more relevant during the pandemic because it triggers a lot of interest from Australian students to learn about how the Indonesia has been dealing with the pandemic and impacted by the outbreak. It is done through 2 weeks of a range of interactive activities such as tutorial, field trips, group discussion, group presentations, and independent learning from various reading materials that we have provided to students before they came to Indonesia or virtually joining the program. So like I mentioned previously, PSST has been running since 2016, but due to the outbreak in Indonesia, the last 2 rounds of PSST were run virtually in December last year and January this year. And I think currently, just this week, it is also currently running virtually at the moment. So it really demonstrates that the initial 2 rounds were a success, and ACICIS has gone on to run it again. This is the course outline of the Public Health Study Tour. If you'd like to know more about this, you can visit our website. In this course outline, there is some information about the structure of the program, the learning outcomes, the assessment, the schedule, and reading materials. And So the students in joining this virtual learning, they were required to engage in the seminar and tutorial guided activities. They also required to engage in the virtual field trips, being involved in Indonesian language class, in interactive cultural activities. They are also required to discuss national health issues with Indonesian public health students through group discussion and presentation at the end of the week. And they also need to submit their respective journals by the end of each week. This is just a snapshot of the timeline or the itinerary that the students have to follow during the 2-week intensive program. We can see here the course will run very intensively since the morning until the evening. And every day the student will engage with either the seminar or field trips or discussions in between. And the seminars ranging from a lot of topics, from infectious diseases, non-infectious diseases, reproductive health, environmental health, and of course, during the pandemic, they also keen to learn about COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia. So I think before, again, like highlighting what Elena mentioned previously, that maybe some really thought how we are going to engage students so that they can feel the real immersion of learning abroad. So it is really important that prior to the program, we set up everything so that the student will feel that they really visiting the field, although they are joining the program at the comfort of their home. So prior to the program, we are working really closely in partnership with Universitas Indonesia to discuss all the learning materials, the conveners, the evaluation strategy, and also the I think the contingency plan if something's happen in the middle of the course. We know that by virtual program, we really rely on the technology. And for some stakeholders, especially those in rural area, they might be have some difficulties in accessing or having a good internet connections. And we also discuss how we're going to engage students during this intensive 2-week program, because there might be some student get bored, and how we're going to actively engage students during this this intensive program. So maybe we need to have a ice-breaking activities or more frequent break time or things like that. So we really discuss that with our partners in Universitas Indonesia during the prior to the program. And also we also organize necessary arrangement with potential institution partners. Like you can see in the itinerary before, we were visiting Ministry of Health virtually, having the seminars from the Ministry of Health. We're visiting Puskesmas, hospital, research centers, NGOs, and community development center. And also we were having a seminar from DFAT. So before the program, we really make sure that we organize necessary arrangement with the potential partners, especially thinking about or anticipate about the contingency plan if there are technical problems happening during the course. And I think I need to point out the importance of involving bodies here. Before the program, we selected students from Universitas Indonesia who had a public health background and also have a good communication skill, because we really rely on them during the learning process. They need to be there with students all the time, helping them to learn about not only about public health, but also about the culture, answering any question that students have during the seminar or field trip or group discussion. So we selected bodies and really working closely in partnership with them during prior to the program. So this is the snapshot of how it looks like during the online session. So this is the session where we visited on virtually visit the Puskesmas. We can see here the staff at the Puskesmas are demonstrating or showing what they are doing during this pandemic. And this is the student observing. And also we did a virtual visit to Kalichode, while the visit to Puskesmas was conducted using a pre-recorded session. In this visit to Kalichode, we did a visit live. So our ACICIS staff were visiting the field, and we have like 2 cameras, 2 operators in there, where we can show the students about the what's happening in the field, and providing students the opportunity to ask questions with the stakeholders in there. So this is also the visit in Kalichode. And we also have an online visit to World Mosquito Program. This is one of the best practice research in Indonesia to curb the transmission of dengue hemorrhagic fever. We did 2 activities here. One is the student had the opportunity to learn from the seminars that is delivered by staff in there. And then the student had the opportunity to see what's happening in the lab. This is the activity that the staff have in feeding the mosquito. And also we invite NGOs to share their experience in helping Indonesian government to overcome the issues around reproductive health services. And this is the example of the group discussion at the end of each day. So buddies, 2 Indonesian buddies are working with the students, and we make the best use of the Zoom feature by enabling them to work in the small group using a breakout room. And we're really aware of how intensive the program would be. So we designed the program where the student also have the opportunity to learn a bit something that is not so serious. So in here we can see that the student also learn how to cook their own lunch with the instruction given by the instructor. And this is the group presentation that they need to do at the end of the week. Again, we really trying to make sure that they are not really get bored with everything, because they have done all the class in front of their computer from the morning until the evening for 2 weeks. So during the group presentation, we ask the student, okay, you can use any background you want. So in here you can see that they use a funny background. Again, I think I need to mention the important role of buddies in Indonesian students here in helping the students learning from their home. So this is I think what we need to really emphasize when we do a virtual learning. We need someone or students that can act as a peer, can do as an icebreaker and help the students with all the learning materials. So in summary, the virtual programs have been very successful. The coordination with sites and institutions being involved in the tour has been successfully done virtually prior to the tour activities. All the interactive activities such as tutorial, field trips, group discussion, group presentation have been successfully conducted through online delivery. The feedback from the presenters highlight their appreciation of the students' enthusiasm of learning about the topics, because the students have been asking a lot of questions, asking for clarifications to presenters. And the students' evaluation about the program were very impressive, that I will show you in a minute. They mentioned that despite the online mode, the program has been very successful in delivering the topics about Indonesian public health challenges and system. So this is the feedback from the student that we get after the program. They mentioned that I think more than 80% of the students voted the support provided by ACICIS Indonesian staff, the quality of the live virtual field trip, and the overall worth of the program was excellent, the green one. And 100% of the students said that they would recommend ACICIS to other students at the university. Also, a high rates of students voting excellent for satisfaction with the general service provided by ACICIS Secretariat in Perth, help provided by student bodies throughout the program, and success of the program in introducing the key public health issues in Indonesia. And this is some of the quotes that the students are saying. This tour has been invaluable in providing a cross-cultural experience that has opened my eyes to the realities of public health in Indonesia, a comprehensive reveal of Indonesian health and its challenges with cultural experience and friendly facilitators. The PSST was incredibly insightful and immersive. overall so much fun, and the opportunity to engage with experts and learn more about public health as well as Indonesian culture was very valuable. So for those of you who would like to know more about Public Health Study Tour, please visit our website. Yeah. I think that's pretty much it. I hand over back to you, Kik.
Thank you so much, Wulan. And thank you to our first presenters also for keeping to time, which makes my job so much easier. I'm now going to hand over to Fran Baxter and Marcella Lapatosa from Value Learning. Fran and Marcia are attending their first ICOC, so let's make them feel welcome. And I'll hand it over to you now, ladies.
Good morning, everyone. Selamat pagi. I hope it's really good to see so many friends online as well. And thank you, Ellie and Wulan, for the presentation. I think it's a good connection to what we are going to be talking next. And we are super excited to share with you the 2020 virtual IEP experience. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to be sharing some of our learnings with you. We want to first introduce IEP and the pivot to the online version. We want to share some of the key components of the virtual program. We're not going to go into much details because at this point, some of the components are very similar to other virtual programs that are running. But we want to spend some more time discussing how to develop intercultural competence online and what makes an effective program to develop the intercultural competence. And of course, we're going to share some of our results in that specific component. So for those who are not familiar with it, but looking at the list of people connected, I think you're all familiar with it. The Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program, or IEP, like as everyone call it, was created 40 years ago. So we are on the 40th anniversary of IEP. It was created in 1992. And with these three goals in mind: one, strengthen the Australia-Indonesia bilateral relationship; two, to enhance the Australia's international reputation and influence; and the third point was to foster cross-cultural awareness and understanding and building that effective professional network between the two countries. So a strong focus on the bilateral relationship, strong focus on expanding the network of professional and influence, and in the cross-cultural awareness and understanding between the two countries. So, and the traditional IEP, as most of you know, I can see some former IEP participants here as well. It was 36 participants, 18 from each country, during 4 months. So participants will spend 2 months in Australia and then 2 months in Indonesia. And there will be the traditional counterparts, like we call it in IEP, which is the buddy system. One Indonesian and one Australia are paired up through the duration of the program. And of course, they had a homestay component in both countries, an internship program, and a community development project. So this is a traditional IEP that's been running successful for 40 years. Most of the former participants are still friends with their counterparts, and they all talk about what a transformational experience has been. So interesting enough, Fran and I were involved in the delivery of the last 3 in-person or traditional IEP. And we were writing the report in April 2020, the final report. And we thought, well, we'll do a recommendation in case the pandemic is not over by October, maybe we can do it online, right? It was just like this was early on in 2020. By July 2020, the Australia-Indonesia Institute reached out to us and said, okay, let's have a look at that proposal. Tell us what you can do online. That's what we did. We started working on it. But of course, we had a lot of noises in our head and around us because there was a lot of challenges that we were hearing. And one was that online was not good enough, that it was not the real program, that we would do this just while we wait for the borders to open, and participants cannot really learn about culture with no immersion. And Ellie touched on that beautifully, because there is this concept that you have to go there to really understand, that you cannot retain participants' interest online. I think Wulan has shown that that's not the case. And that at the end of the day, you cannot really achieve the program outcomes if you're online. So everyone was telling this to us. We were wondering ourselves about these issues. So our question was, how do we transform such a rich experience to a virtual format? How do we replicate that long-lasting friendship? How do we help our participants really develop the cross-cultural understanding and awareness that they talk about so much? And to discuss that, how do we do it? Before, I want to just touch on the concept of intercultural competence as defined by Janet Bennett, which is a set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills that support effective and appropriate interaction with those who are different to you. There's many definitions, but basically it's a set of skills, additional knowledge that help you interact effective and appropriate with those who are different to you. And traditionally, in international education, Ellie discussed this as well, it was believed that you had to have a cultural immersion. You had to go there to be able to develop this competence. And actually, international experiences were believed to be the best predictor of developing these skills. And it's based on the old, Ellie mentioned the assumed absorption, but also this old theory of the contact theory, that just by interacting with those who are different to you, you can develop those skills. However, in the last 10, 15 years, there's a body of research showing that that's not the case. This is one of the examples, the book by Mick Vandenberg and colleagues, which includes the Georgetown Consortium project and many, many other studies. But if you go into journals today, you can see it. We were used to the anecdotal stories about international education transforming our lives, right? But there was not enough evidence of, are they really learning? And what are they learning? And are they really more intercultural competent because they spend a year in Indonesia or Japan or wherever, right? And what this research is showing that, no, they're not. Actually, the best predictors of developing intercultural competence are these four components, among others. But one very, very strong one is the intentional design and reflection that you do during a program. So your design clearly attached to your goals, but that reflection, that when you help participants make meaning of what they're experiencing, it's not just being there, but what are you making with being there? And that's where skill facilitation plays a key role. So the facilitation needs to be done by someone who does have those skills, who does have intercultural competence. It's really hard to teach someone speak Indonesian if you don't speak it yourself. So that's another key component. The third component was the provision of cultural content. So being in the culture is not enough. We need to provide our participants with some frameworks, with some ideas and concepts for them to, again, make meaning of what they're seeing, what they're observing, what they're experiencing. And this provision of content needs to be done for mobility programs before, during, and after in a virtual mobility program throughout the duration of the program. So it has to be holistic. So this is what research shows, that this is the best way to do it. The studies actually compare, because we have these beliefs in international education that having homestay will help you develop those competences better. But the study actually show that just staying with the family doesn't make the difference. It's the type of interaction, reflections, and conversations that you're having with the family that makes the difference. That's why facilitation is important. So, so with these principles in mind, that we then embarked on, okay, how do we make this happen? Let's use these principles that we know are effective to do it virtually. So the virtual IEP was a 7-week program. Participants had to commit 20 hours a week to this. And as I said before, you know, we had the speaker series with some amazing speakers. We did have a virtual internship, but we had something very specific that's where we want to focus our time next, which is the Global Competence Certificate. And I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. But we kept the counterparts, and again, like Wulan mentioned about teachers, how important they are in that relationship building. We also had a mentors program, and participants work in groups for developing a social impact project focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So at the end of the program, we had 6 projects focusing on one of the goals. And we also had a business hackathon. And each one of these components were clearly selected by us to meet the goals. They're either focusing on their cross-cultural understanding or on building the relationships or extending the professional network, which are the key IEP goals. So let me talk a bit about the Global Competence Certificate. The Global Competence Certificate is being developed by AFS, and it was used to support mobility programs. And we did use it when the program was in person as well. But this time we use it as a key component of the program. It has 20 modules covering cultural content from value dimensions, communication styles, conflict styles, coping strategies, power and privilege, microaggressions. So it's very comprehensive, and it comes in a variety of videos, forum discussion on the forums, and quizzes. So participants can complete these modules on their own time, but what we did is at the end of each week, they had to complete a number of modules, and we had a group reflection call to help them make meaning of what were they learning online, but also what were they experienced with their counterparts and internships, etc. And the Global Competence Certificate is designed to achieve these 4 learning outcomes: self-awareness, awareness of others, emotional intelligence, and bridging across cultures, which is basically the process to develop those skills and attitudes needed for intercultural competence. So it fit perfectly with our goals, and that's why we selected it. And yes, and that was a key component of our program for developing intercultural competence. And I'm gonna hand it now over to Fran, so she can tell us how do we do.
Okay, so when we thought about the outcomes, one of the really key components for us was to have to approach the area of evaluation of our program in exactly the same way, to be completely intentional in the design so that we could track the outcomes as we did the actual program. So we used a number of tools. We used some quantitative validated tool, the intercultural effectiveness scale. We used a range of qualitative measures to gather feedback. We had weekly surveys. There were surveys at the end of the program. We had individual interviews with participants. And we gathered that data in a way that really enabled us, both during the program and at the end of the program, to identify areas that needed to be tweaked or changed as we went along, and also to feed into the program that we'll run this year. So looking at the first of these, we gathered information from our participants on what their expectations were at the start of the program. And the key areas are listed on this chart here. And at the end, in our final session, we went back to those goals and asked the participants to rate how they think we went. Were their expectations met? And you can see that the highest rating elements were developed meaningful intercultural understanding, really significant, and enjoyed and had fun. And we know how important that is. One of the engagement strategies is to ensure that the participants really feel connected to the program and that it's meeting their needs in order to enable that learning to take place. So really right across the board, the results were extremely high. The lowest ranking was the improved language. And even though our participants told us that everyone went from either no language to some language, or being extremely fluent to gaining additional language skills, it really wasn't one of our key goals, and therefore not surprising that the results were just a little lower on that element. At the same time, we also asked participants around would they recommend the program to others? If they had their time over, would they do it again? And without exception, everyone said yes. So there was a high level of satisfaction. We also gathered evidence, as I said, right along the way, and very similar to what Wulan and ACICIS were saying, those relationships, gathering the relationships really enhance the program. Deep relationships enhance the learning, but they also are great for engagement. And I think these even exceeded our expectations. So just a little bit more about that and a few of the screenshots from that relationship development. One of the really interesting things I think was that we always expected that the most important part of the IEP program is the relationships that are developed early on and last a lifetime. And I can see, you know, there are people on the call that may well have been on a program like this and have got close friendships with their counterparts. And we were hoping that this would happen, and certainly we were very intentional in the activities that we designed for counterparts, including having actions that they would participate in together each week. What really blew us away was how much additional contact they had with counterparts and the group in general beyond the program. So, you know, using their own time to connect. And you can see some fantastic Christmas photos here, whereby, you know, families invited the counterparts into the dining room on Christmas Day. Or we can see Natasha in the photo being shown around the local Indonesian community where her counterpart was. We had examples of parents meeting each other in the program, something that had never happened in the in-person experience. And again, back to comments, there's no end of comments on the counterparts and the importance that they played in really building the knowledge. But the other thing was around these professional networks. It was important to us, and very similar to other programs, we had an amazing speaker series. There were some very high level speakers and opportunities for the participants to interact with the speakers on many occasions. And this really enhanced their networks, and we saw people, the participants go on to continue those relationships. I can see one of our mentors, for instance, is on this call, and some of the other mentors also introduced their mentees and others to the broader Australia-Indonesia community, and many of those relationships are continuing, and we anticipate they will continue even further. But one of the areas we'd like to spend a little bit of time describing in a little bit more depth is how we measured the intercultural competence using the intercultural effectiveness scale, a validated tool which provides an assessment of how effectively people, we interact, or the participants interact with people from different cultural backgrounds. That we offered this survey both before the program started to the 36 participants, and again post-program ending, around about 4 weeks after the program ended. And participants were given a detailed report on where they stood on the scale, and also in the final report a comparison to before and after. And what did we find? So the three key elements are continuous learning, interpersonal engagement, and hardiness. And they're further broken down into those elements you can see below. So quite extensive areas of measurement. We've used this tool before, and we find it very effective. It's highly validated against literally hundreds of thousands of participants across the world in all different kinds of geographic locations and from different backgrounds, both across age, career, and education. So what does it mean? Continuous learning. I'll leave you just to read that. But the key elements here include self-awareness, a genuine interest in others, and that striving to understand more. Interpersonal engagement is your interest in other cultures and the importance of developing those relationships. And then the development of positive interpersonal relationships. And finally, hardiness. This is an interesting one. So how we deal with the emotions around difficult and confusing, ambiguous situations. Our ability to be open-minded and non-judgmental, how those reactions are to different circumstances, and managing the emotions when the times get tough. Now, what's interesting here is that it's very easy to see in immersion programs that when you're in exceptionally confusing situations, that stresses are quite common. Our participants told us that they experience this need for resilience, this need to be hardy, even in the virtual program, because many of the things they're experiencing, interacting in these cross-cultural teams, working on projects together or establishing relationships, were just as evident in the virtual program. So the results. Each of those elements is broken down into a 7-point scale, and before, the overall total scores sat with participants across the 36 in the high category of 36%, and that increased to 57% after. And the participants with the lowest scores originally sat at before 12%, and that reduced down to 3%. These are very significant scores. If we look at the continuous learning, this was the area of greatest significance. And so the participants in the high category, remember this includes things like self-awareness and interested in learning about others in a meaningful way, went from under 20% to over 50%. A very significant increase. Interpersonal relationships, engagement, another good result across the board. And finally, hardiness. So in each area, we found significant growth in intercultural effectiveness using this validated and highly effective tool. It should be noted that we also used the IES on the previous 3 years in-person programs and did see some increases, but not to the extent that we're seeing here, which is very interesting. But the intentionality of every single action in the virtual program, I think is one of the reasons why this has been the result. So let's go back to those challenges. Online is not as good, it's not the real program. You know, this is something we said ourselves, and we certainly heard from others. I should say it was a very common statement from previous alumni who had that amazing in-person connection, the travel opportunity. They really felt that that was the critical element of the IEP program. The participants can't learn about culture without immersion, and again, going back to Ellie's and also the work that Wulan described around ACICIS, that you can't retain interest online. I think that was my biggest worry. What if somewhere along the line the participants decide not to turn up because they're a bit zoomed out, or that you can't achieve the program outcomes? Well, we found this to be false. We found that all of those things were absolutely achievable, so that when the goals are clear, the design is intentional, virtual programs can and do deliver true intercultural competence. They can create lasting, meaningful relationships, and they can expand the participants' network and strengthen the relationship across the two nations. It can be and is enough. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to hand back to Pete.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you to all 4 of our presenters this morning. Ellie really set the scene for us by contextualising Australia-Indonesia mobility programs And she also challenged the traditional authority of the field in bilateral intercultural and intercultural learning. Thanks also to Trevor Goddard, who made a really important comment, I think, about the importance of and the contributions that anthropology can provide in that space as well. We then took a deep dive into 2 recent online programs, and we were expertly guided through those by those programs facilitators. So we had Wulan for the public health study tour delivered by ACICICIS. And of course, we had Fran and Marcella just then taking us through the online IEP program. For me, I think one of the most important takeouts is that these programs didn't just go online, and they didn't try to replicate the physical program in an online environment, but rather they were intentionally designed with the online space in mind, and really leverage some of the advantages that online can provide, you know, particularly overcoming geographical boundaries, just like today's session has a very different audience precisely because it is online. What I'd like to do is to kick off with some questions, and we've got some coming through the Q&A box, which is great. Just a reminder to everyone that if you do ask a question, we are in a recorded session, so your question is recorded as well. I see that Thomas Barker has asked a question about language learning, and that was going to be my first question as well. So Thomas, I'm going to combine our questions, and if I haven't done that, if you're still not getting the information you want, please feel free to let us know in the Q&A box as well. Because obviously we have concern, and particularly this week, around Indonesian language programs at several Australian universities. This week, La Trobe and UWA in particular are under spotlight. So to all of our panelists, have you seen learning abroad through ACICICIS and IEP and other programs having an impact on students' uptake or interest in language learning? What are the options for them when they go back to Australia to continue language learning? I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. So I'm actually going to ask Fran or Marcella to start off by this, because I know you've got your own personal experience as well, and then we'll go across to Wulan and Ellie.
Well, I can go first, Fran, if you're okay with that. Oh, we were just saying, Fran and I have been working with IEP for 4 years. And actually, the virtual program encouraged us to start learning Indonesian. So yesterday we had our first lesson. And I know it's an anecdotal, but yesterday we had the launch of IEP 2021, and we heard from all the participants, even those who didn't have any Indonesian language when they started IEP, they're all studying Indonesian now. So it's definitely a motivator for them to study the language. The improvement of the language during the program, because of that wasn't the focus, it wasn't as high. But with these principles that we just share in mind, there's no reason why you can't design an online program that develops good language skills, right?
Wulan, did you want to make a comment about language learning within the study tours? Obviously, ACICICIS studies tours don't necessarily focus on language learning as one of their key outcomes, but I'm sure that you have participants who already have Bahasa Indonesia skills or who might be motivated to learn after the program. Just need to unmute yourself, Wulan.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, as Kik mentioned, language is not the main learning outcomes that the public health study tour has. But in the session, in the program, we have 2 classes for students to learn about the language, Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia. I think during the virtual program, the feedback from students that we got is they are really satisfied with how the language class has been delivered during the virtual program. They know how to express the basic things in Bahasa Indonesia. They know how to ask a question on health issues in Bahasa Indonesia. And from the feedback that we got, the student also mentioned that they really want to learn further about the language once they finish the program. So I think in summary, I think the virtual mode delivery of the program doesn't really put challenge on how the student will learn about the language.
Thanks, Wulan. And Ellie, did you have any final comments on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Kik. Thanks for the question. I guess one thing I find really interesting in this space to look at, language proficiency, language acquisition, certainly for Australian students who've been going there, traditionally going there and now going there virtually. But this notion that, we started to see this a lot with, the New Colombo Plan programs that were that had been developed, where students were going up in, say, a public health program like Wulan has described, or an agriculture program, a journalism program. And the language learning is a component of ACICIS programs and of many other university programs that go up to Indonesia. But what you're starting to see, and I find this fascinating, is that students who are not coming from Indonesian language majors or even Asian studies majors may go up through these other disciplines and through other disciplinary interests, and then come back and actually have an interest in learning Indonesian. And I started to see this time and time again, and certainly colleagues at ACICIS and elsewhere would be seeing this with their students, that, it's not everyone, but you will get a handful of students who come up through those different disciplines, then come back, they have a renewed interest in it. Maybe even they did some at school many years ago. They can speak a few basic words and they want to pick it up again. So what I think is really interesting here is that there's it's a small cohort, don't get me wrong, the numbers are not huge, but there is a cohort of students here where there is an opportunity to actually be enhancing that Indonesian language learning and teaching once they return. The challenge, of course, which Kik has alluded to before, the challenge is that when they get back, there's simply, we're finding more and more universities around Australia now closing their Indonesian language programs, which is just heartbreaking and short-sighted. But they don't have the option of actually then continuing it in many cases. So you then see students actually taking it on at, adult education centres or through continuing learning centres, and not actually being able to then get credit for it as part of their degrees. So the lack of a focus on language options for students when they return it's the missing piece in the puzzle. So.
Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you for that question, for answering that question. We also have one from Nabila Kauronisa, and I'm going to pose this question to Fran and Marcella, and also to Wulan. So this is about technical innovation. And I guess it's a practical question around were there any special technical innovations or tools that you use to support online delivery, and especially to facilitate a more immersive program and to develop practical skills? So obviously this could be about the programs you've just run, or any plans you have for future programs as well. Fran and Marcella, can I go to you first on that one?
Sure. We actually kept the technical side fairly simple in the previous program, not overcomplicating it. Though, of course, the Global Competence Certificate was definitely an online kind of focal point, and we use that to anchor the rest of the program. So we kind of embedded the full calendar within the Global Competence Certificate. We use the forum for interaction. We posed the activities for the counterparts all within that platform. This year we're looking at the potential to use some more interactive collaborative tools online, so that we might be able to enhance, or at least trial them to enhance the interactions. We had few problems really with the technology, which was also a concern prior to the program starting. We thought there might be, lack of access or insufficient bandwidth to, really enable everyone to be effectively online, but it wasn't the case. So I think it's important for the technology to enhance the process as opposed to be the process. And for us, it was a fairly simple approach.
Thanks for that, Fran. Wulan, did you have anything to say about some of the tech tools or strategies that ACICIS used in the public health study tour?
Yeah, in the public health study tour, we require students to have a group discussion with their peers, and also doing their assignment and presentations. I think using the technologies like a Zoom call when they can have a discussion through online, and also using the Google Drive where they can work together in the platform at the same time. So I think that would be that was the example of the technology innovation that we used during the program.
Great, thank you. We've had a really interesting question from Eloise Dolan from the Asia Society, and I'll read this one out. How do we change attitudes towards online programs as truly meaningful experiences for young people who are on the fence about them? Asia literacy is already on the decline. How do we hook young people who aren't already in the Asia space? Ellie, I'm gonna throw this one to you if that's okay.
Absolutely, thank you, and thanks for the question. Look, I think there's a few different ways to address this. Firstly, it's really part of a broader strategy around starting earlier. So, you know, you don't just magically get to university and all of a sudden have an interest necessarily in Asia, or all of a sudden necessarily have an interest in language learning. So I think part of this focus really needs to be on starting that engagement with young people at a much earlier age, so preschools, primary schools, high schools, and then working out ways to actually continue that engagement through to the tertiary level. So, I mean, just to go back to the language issue for a second. So, you know, the Australia-Indonesia Institute has just commissioned a study with the Asia Education Foundation, looking at a rationale of why we're studying Indonesian and looking at that crisis in Indonesian language teaching and learning. So that's one sort of element of it in terms of the language learning and the language teaching part of it. But in terms of actually getting people interested in Asia literacy, again, I think that really needs to be embedded a lot earlier. And we do see some developments of that, you know, in things like in the new curriculum, sorry, in the Australia curriculum, and different capabilities that are in that as well. And certainly Fran and Mars and Kik can speak more to that if they're experiencing the secondary sector as well. But what that's actually doing for young people's exposure at an earlier age as well. So that's the first part of it that I would say in terms of starting earlier. Secondly, I think it speaks to that point as well that I mentioned earlier around this concept of internationalization at home. So particularly while we're in this global pandemic and while we're in virtual modalities, this idea really of educators at all of those different levels that I mentioned, really building the internationalization curriculum for their students. So if we're not going abroad, but actually having an interest in Asia literacy and building Asia literacy into the curriculum becomes really important, and doing that virtually as well. So normalizing this idea of, okay, today we're going to chat to our partner school in Indonesia or our sister school in Japan or wherever the case might be, but normalizing that as part of the everyday classroom practice, so that it doesn't come as this shock that when there is a global pandemic or something as disruptive as COVID has been to our learning and teaching, that all of a sudden we have to pivot everything. I think actually moving forward, this offers some really interesting and unique ways that we can change the way that young people understand and live out Asia literacy.
Thanks, Ellie. And I do want to follow up with you because I think we've got a related question from Greg Feely as well. But first, Marcella, I know that you also wanted to contribute to this question.
Well, just a quick addition to everything that Ellie said, which is super important and fundamental for the engagement. I think when it comes to online in particular, we need to keep telling the story. Like last year, we didn't have stories to share. So we had to convince people that this was worth doing with no evidence, right? Now we have it. So we need to keep putting those who have had the virtual experience now, we need to get them out there, sharing how important it was for them, how they got engaged into language learning, or how that influenced their area of studies. So we need to keep spreading the word and showing evidence of how it works. And I think, to Eloise's question, Asia Society is setting up a youth forum around this topic in particular. So I think, you know, if we all collaborate in spreading the word and sharing the stories, we will see more engagement in this area. And we need to stop saying while we wait for the borders to open. We need to stop saying while we can't travel.
Exactly. Ellie, I just want to go back to you with Greg's question there. I think everyone can see that one online. His question is, I guess, the other side in terms of the students who do want to specialise in Indonesian language and study. To what degree can online foster and enable them to pursue their studies as well? He makes a comment about it's the hollowing out of expertise, which is becoming such a problem in Australia now. Have you got any comments on that one for us?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kik, and thanks for the question, Greg. I think, you know, looking at this issue in terms of online learning and the potential for essentially creating a new generation of Indonesian specialists from Indonesian studies, I mean, obviously looking around Australia at the moment, it's incredibly concerning. We're all concerned about this. You know, everyone in this conference is concerned about what's going on with Indonesian studies and with Indonesian language learning and teaching in Australia right now, this hollowing out, as you rightly describe it. I think, again, as Marcella has just mentioned, I think the way we need to look at this is not simply of waiting for the borders to reopen. Yes, of course, we are all waiting for the borders to reopen and we'll all be I'll see you all there on the first flight out. However, I think it's about looking at what we can actually do in the meantime to actually, you know, create those that they can continue creating that expertise. So the things, I mean, universities are already doing this. They've already pivoted their language learning programs. I think in terms of the actual specialization of language teaching for a moment, Greg, you know, looking at what ACICIS was doing over the summer and now the winter programs as well with the Indonesian language short course in Salatiga. So continuing that specialized language training. You know, it's funny, some of the feedback from the students has been that even though it's over Zoom and you don't get the kind of interaction face to face, it has meant that the program has not completely fallen by the wayside. And in fact, in many ways, students have then been able to have these one-on-one discussions with their tutors. They've been able to talk over WhatsApp. They've been able to build up vocabularies, you know, using Duolingo. Through their sessions together using Padlet, they're brainstorming different ideas and learning new vocab together in group settings as well. So I actually do think that the technologies can be just as innovative and interactive as classroom settings as well, particularly for language learning. When you think about the mechanics of language learning as well, watching a teacher, you know, learning how to form and pronounce those words as well. I think that that's a really important technical part of the language learning there as well. But speaking more broadly to the sort of specialisation and that cohort of Indonesian specialists as well, this, you know, I think we all understand in the ICOC context, this is our work, this is our advocacy. It is a long and prolonged strategy for all of us that unfortunately we have to keep advocating for this. You know, we have to keep advocating at the state level and at the federal level that this is really, really important, that we don't lose this level of expertise in Australia, of our nearest neighbour. So I don't know that that's a positive answer, but I think it's, you know, to keep on fighting the good fight and recognising also that we're in a really unique position to do that with this kind of online modalities as well, and working with our Indonesian colleagues to do that actually more easily over Zoom. We don't have to get on a plane to go and have conferences, and we don't have to get on a plane to go and have these meetings, but actually doing it over Zoom. And then as Marcella mentioned and Fran mentioned before as well, finding the data that speaks to that as well. So looking at, you know, what we're actually achieving out of this period of online learning. And I know that ACICIS is documenting some of this, other teams are documenting what's coming out of online learning as well. And seeing how we can then present that as a strategy for Indonesian studies and Indonesian language learning moving forward.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks also for the question there, Greg. We've got 3 more questions that I'd like to get to, and I'm going to combine Ross Tapsel's and Janelle Mayer's questions because it's about the future, and I think we've just been touching on that. So Ross's question, speaks to the fact that, you know, we can all agree that an online exchange program has many benefits, and it's certainly better than no program. But do any of our panelists want to explicitly argue that these online programs should continue once borders open up, either to replace the original face-to-face or in addition to them? And Janelle's also asked about the future of virtual learning. Do we see value in still offering virtual experiences? So I'd particularly like to hear from our IAP and ACICIS presenters on this one. Marcella or Fran, would you like to take this one first?
I'll take that. I think I would argue to death that they need to continue. If we think about pre-pandemic, only 1% of the population had the opportunity to have an international experience. That was always a concern in the international education field. How do we become more inclusive? How do we reach more people at this pace? You know, a lot of people, more people are missing out that are being included in these experiences and the opportunity to develop those global skills. So I think virtual is the opportunity to reach out to that 99% of the population who are not being included, is more flexible, is in terms of budget, is much more affordable, and is inclusive. So I think there's plenty of reasons why we should keep doing it. And of course we should grow the 1% that has the international experience. We should be more intentional about that 1%. We can't just keep putting people on planes and not worry about what they're going to be learning and developing while they're there. That's an investment. We need to make sure that the investment pays off while we make sure that the other 99% is included, and virtual is the way, in my opinion.
So Marcela, would you say, I guess, if you had the choice, would you continue a fully online program, or would you be taking the best parts out of your online program to complement a physical travel program?
A, B, and C are correct. I will continue the in-person. I would have an online only one, and the in-person will be blended. So we'll definitely make sure that we maximize all the components. But look, only 36 people a year do IEP. We could do 200 if we, with the same budget. Oh, sorry, I didn't say that. But yeah, there is a huge opportunity there. And I guess it's the same for our teachers.
Wulan, is there anything from the online experience that you would continue doing in a future face-to-face public health study tour, or would you keep the whole program online? What would you do there?
I was just reflecting in the public health study tour. So we have various activities like seminars, tour guided activities, field visits, group discussions, group presentations. I think in terms of seminar, for example, I think it's okay for us to continue the online mode or delivery. And we are, as the pandemic roll out, we are becoming more and more aware that we can do seminar and meetings online, and we're seeing a lot of webinar, thousands and thousands of webinar conducted. So I think this seminar that would be okay to be continued online. And also for the group discussion and group meeting, I think there are lots of technology available to help us on that. The one that might be, I think, need further consideration is how the students can observe the health system operate in Indonesia, for example, like visiting the puskesmas, visiting the hospital. They have a very different, they saw a very different experience when they do that in person. But I think during the pandemic, you can do that as well using like pre-recording session, or someone in Indonesia doing the videotape live where the students can see online. So I think there are not much challenge and I think it is still useful to continue the program in the future.
Lovely, thank you. I've got one final question from David Hill, and I'm going to throw to Fran on this one because it's a question about the IES and subjectivity and objectivity in terms of, might the IES results for online versus in-country be due to a participant not actually having to confront the same degree of cultural challenge? Sorry to limit you on this one, Fran, but if you could give us a 2-minute response, that would be great. You're on mute.
Yep. You're right. The IES is a self-assessment tool. However, it is strongly validated. So it's been around for a very long time. There's been improvements and there's lots of evidence of it being effective. I think the thing that's quite important to note here that this was not the only tool that we used, and we backed that up with a lot of monitoring of the forum. We were watching the participants in their interactions and the types of things that they were discussing against those key, I guess, really against that rubric of, self-awareness, other awareness, and bridging the difference. And you can see very definite changes there. As far as this, the difference between in-country and online, I mean, to a certain degree, based on previous thinking, we could expect the in-person programs to achieve higher degrees of intercultural competence because of that thinking around immersion. So if we consider, you know, the standard thinking around international education that Ellie talked about earlier, it is that being there, going there, and being in that environment is where that great growth takes place. So what we're looking at is the fact that without going there, but with this program that really helped develop the competence, they were able to achieve the outcomes. So is it an absolutely foolproof and perfect tool? None of them are. But I think the combination of things suggests that that growth was definitely achieved.
Thank you so much, Fran. And with that, we're out of time for our session, but this is a really rich discussion, and I want to thank our presenters and also our attendees here today for you know, making the conversation so lively and having such in-depth questions as well. I'm going to finish with a couple of plugs. Ellie alluded in her presentation to the next edition of Inside Indonesia, which will focus precisely on the topics we've been talking about today. I also want to encourage everyone who needs to encourage other students and friends and colleagues to apply for IEP to do so. Fran and Marcel, I understand you had your launch last night, right? Yes, excellent. So there's information up online about that. If you need more information to share with your students, please contact Fran and Mars. I know they'll be only too pleased to help you out there. And obviously you'll also be able to tell your students, or, you know, perhaps if you're a student, your friends, the advantages of the IEP online program, and to really grab that, because I think online is going to be here to stay for a while as well. There's no point waiting for something else. A huge thank you to our presenters today. And I think it's now time for morning tea. It feels a bit early for that for me here in Singapore, but enjoy the rest of your ICOC conference, everybody.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you, Kik. See you.
Thank you.